Book 6, Chapter 2, Part 1 of the History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 6, Practice, Chapter 2, Part 1, the Inquisitorial Process. In considering the judicial functions of the Inquisition, we shall meet with much that is abhorrent to our conceptions of justice. We shall see that the accused was assumed to be guilty, and that the object of the tribunal was to induce or coerce him to confess his guilt; that, for this purpose, he was substantially deprived of facilities for defense, and that the result, for the most part, depended on his powers of endurance, which the judges, at discretion, could test to the utmost. It would not be easy to construct a system more repugnant to rational methods for the ascertainment of truth. At the same time, the vices of the inquisitorial process, at the period under consideration, were not wholly confined to the Inquisition. It is true that it was responsible for their origin, in the 13th century, when the jurisprudence of Europe was undergoing reconstruction, and the methods which it framed for the conviction of heresy offered such advantages to the prosecution that they were adopted in the secular courts of nearly all the lands where the Holy Office found a foothold, and became an essential part of criminal codes. The judge, in place of an impartial dispenser of justice, grew to be virtually a prosecutor, with unlimited power of wringing confession from the accused. The latter was practically compelled to prove his innocence, and the trained and subtle intellects of the bench were engaged in conflict with the cunning or stupidity of the miserable wretches brought before them. On the one side was the pride, resolved not to be baffled; on the other, the desperate effort at self-preservation, and, in the unequal struggle, innocence was much more apt to suffer than guilt to escape. So completely did this identification of judge and prosecutor dominate the critical jurisprudence of Latin Europe, that in France, until the law of December 8, 1897, after the jury system had been in use for a century, the judge, armed with the summaria or dossier of incriminating evidence, opened the trial by interrogating the accused and assuming his guilt, an interrogation which was liable speedily to degenerate into a duel between them, in which the judge endeavored to break down the line of defense which the accused was obliged unskilfully to reveal. In this the kingdoms of Aragon were strikingly exceptional, for the inquisitorial process, as we have seen, was prohibited. In Aragon itself the interests of the accused were carefully guarded. There were elaborate provisions against arbitrary arrest, although admission to bail was limited. Accusers had to give security, and were liable to double costs and damages in case of failure to prove charges. Witnesses were diligently cross-examined, and, in cases involving serious punishment, 5 disinterested jurists were associated with the judge in passing sentence, against which there was right of appeal. There was no public prosecutor before the revision of procedure by the Cortes of Monzon in 1510, and then it took many years to bring the office into general use. The abuse existed of prosecutions in absentia, though, if the accused subsequently appeared, he had the right to appeal, and still worse was the custom of keeping the prisoner chained until his trial was concluded. In Valencia, and probably elsewhere, there was a peculiarly valuable privilege that no one, whether defendant or witness, was compelled to answer questions that would criminate him. In Biscay, the fueros, as revised in 1526 and in force until the Revolution, were very emphatic in providing the accused with all information necessary to his defense. In Castile the processes by accusation and by inquisition were both employed. An accuser, however, was obliged to give security and was subject to fines if it appeared that he acted through malice. If there was no accuser, the judge, or alcalde, made inquisition and proceeded summarily to try the case. When, under the impulse of Isabella and the guidance of Alfonso Diaz de Montalvo, the Cortes of Toledo in 1480 revised the criminal jurisprudence of the land, their action served as a basis for all subsequent legislation. It breathes the spirit of justice, the rigorous punishment of guilt and avoidance of punishment of innocence. The courts were enjoined to quick dispatch. The accused was to have all necessary opportunities for defense. If poor, counsel was supplied at the public expense. He could recuse any judge for cause and appeal from any decision, and he was always entitled to give bail. Prosecution in absentia, however, was allowed. After 3 summonses of 9 days each, the accused could be prosecuted in rebeldia, as contumacious, and be condemned. While thus in Castile legislation was dictated by a sincere desire for justice, in practice the accused was subjected to unnecessary disadvantages and hardships. We chance to have the proceedings in the case of Francisco Fernandez de Montemayor, of Seville, tried in Ciudad Real in 1499, on a charge of petty thefts on fellow lodgers of an inn, in which the general course of procedure bears sufficient resemblance to that of the Inquisition to show that the latter borrowed its forms from the secular courts with modifications to facilitate conviction. When Montemayor was arrested in his inn, September 10th, his effects were sequestrated, locked in his chest and left in charge of the innkeeper. When money was needed for his prison expenses, the judges, on his application, sent the prison scrivener to take out a prescribed sum in the presence of witnesses. The witnesses on both sides were examined on a series of written interrogatories, a most imperfect method, and were not cross-examined. Their names were not concealed, but the accused was kept in jail and was not present. His own examination was made by the judges in an audiencia de cárcel. He was allowed to retain an advocate who presented a written defense. The charges were frivolous and, on October 28th, the judges pronounced that the fiscal had not proved his case, which acquitted the prisoner. His treatment in jail had been harsh. He was an hidalgo and, a few days after arrest, he asked to be treated as a man of good lineage and not to be herded with criminals, whereupon he was placed in a cell with a heavy chain under close guard. On acquittal, he begged to be released from his fetters, which was done on his swearing not to leave the prison, for he was not discharged. Unluckily, the testimony contained some heretical speeches, though the witnesses believed them to have been uttered in jest, as he was always striving to be jocular. The secular court could take no cognizance of them, but the Inquisition claimed him, and he was delivered to it in chains, November 9th. His trial had occupied 6 weeks. The Inquisition kept him for 2 years, and, on November 10, 1501, it penanced him and made him abjure de vehementi. Doubtless the poor wretch was ruined. If we find reason to believe that the tribunals of the Inquisition were largely actuated by passion or greed, they were in this no worse than the secular courts. The constantly reiterated complaints of the Cortes, during the 16th century, assume that the whole judicial system of Castile, from the highest to the lowest, was not so much an instrumentality of justice as a venal organization to extort the largest possible sums from pleaders, and to oppress the poor for the benefit of the rich. We might, perhaps, regard this as rhetorical exaggeration if we had not the opportunity of seeing how a court of the highest rank, the Royal Audiencia of Seville, in 1598 disregarded all law and justice when it sought to gratify its spite on the magistracy of that city. We have seen, Volume 1, page 362, the absurd quarrel raised with the judges by the inquisitors on the occasion of the obsequies of Philip II. The judges, unable to avenge themselves on the tribunal, discharged their wrath upon the civic authorities, who had sought to mediate and keep the peace. They arrested on the spot several of the highest officials, including 2 members of the great house of Ponce de Leon, and, in spite of the indecency of sitting as judges in their own case, they prosecuted their prisoners. They took the testimony of 37 witnesses on written interrogatories, containing leading questions, and accepted hearsay evidence of the veriest gossip. The accused were allowed to see the accusation framed by the fiscal, but not the evidence, and no opportunity of making defense was permitted. Thereupon their advocates recused the judges, but the recusation was not only rejected on the day of its presentation, but the accused and their advocates were all heavily fined for offering it, and, the next day, sentence was pronounced condemning the prisoners to various terms of suspension from office, exile, fines, and costs. Both they and the fiscal appealed, and a second hearing was held, in which the defendants at last were allowed to see the evidence. Both parties meanwhile had been applying to the Council of Castile, which ordered that the sentence should not be confirmed without being first submitted to it, but the judges anticipated this, and, the day before the order was received, hastily assembled with closed doors, and in the absence of the accused and their counsel, affirmed the decision and ordered its immediate execution, with the exception of Ponce de Leon Almanza, who was of kin to one of them. The sentences were carried out with cruel vindictiveness. There was pestilence in the district to which the exiles were sent, and they were brought back sick to Seville, where the alcalde mayor, Juan Ponce de Leon, died, and the others were treated with the utmost harshness. When the royal courts permitted themselves such arbitrary perversions of justice, we need not be surprised that the Inquisition was reckless, shielded as it was from responsibility by impenetrable secrecy. Between them, the Spanish people were sorely vexed. To this the spiritual courts offered a contrast in their customary benignity towards clerical offenders, amounting almost to immunity. The course of procedure was that, when a denunciation was made to the provisor or vicar general, he took testimony or sent an official to make inquisition. The accused was summoned and was admitted to bail. The trial took the shape of an action between him and the fiscal, who presented an accusation to which the defense made reply. Witnesses for the defense were examined, publication of evidence was made, and, when both parties had concluded, the judge named a day for pronouncing sentence. From two cases of the 16th century, of which the papers are before me, it would appear that there was little delay, that formalities were loosely observed, and that the proverbial leniency shown to the cloth rendered the whole a matter of comparative indifference. One of these illustrates the expiring episcopal jurisdiction over heresy and its supplantation by the Inquisition. In 1551, Diego de Carcano, a priest of Ciudad Real, was tried for heretical acts and speeches, which he freely admitted, saying that they had been in jest, and that he ought not to have trifled with the things of God. The trial was concluded within 3 weeks, and Diego was confined for a few days in a parish church with spiritual exercises, besides paying costs, amounting to about 32 reales. 2 years later, Inquisitor Valtodano, on a visitation, chanced to hear of the affair. He treated the episcopal trial as invalid, and vindicated together the faith and the inquisitorial jurisdiction by a second prosecution of the unlucky priest. The laxity of the Church towards its erring members was still further illustrated by the reforms adopted in the Provincial Synod of Toledo, held in 1565 to receive the Council of Trent. The fiscal was ordered not to denounce any one to the judge. No inquisition was to be made, unless there was a legitimate general report against a culprit, and then the judge was required to investigate carefully whether it arose from malevolence or from reputable persons. If the fiscal desired to accuse anyone, he was subjected to the laws concerning accusers, and if he failed to prove the charges, he was liable for the costs and to punishment at the discretion of the judge. All pecuniary penalties were to be expended in pious uses, and not for the advantage of the bishop or his vicar general, and an official was to be deputed to receive them and render a strict account. The most marked distinction between the procedure of the Inquisition and that of the other jurisdictions was the inviolable secrecy in which all its operations were shrouded. There were, indeed, other evil peculiarities, but this it was which inflicted the greatest wrong on its victims, and exposed the inquisitor to the strongest temptation to abuse his power. It was an inheritance from the 13th century, when the Inquisition early discovered the greater freedom of action and the increased popular dread resulting from the mystery which emancipated it from public opinion and veiled all its actions, until their outcome was revealed in the solemnities of the auto de fe. The Roman Inquisition retained it, but in a somewhat modified degree. All its officials were sworn to silence as to everything that occurred in the congregation, but, in 1629, this was explained as restricted only to matters that might prejudice cases. Very different was the awful silence so enforced in Spain that it formed an important factor in the power of the Holy Office. It is not a little remarkable that, when the institution was introduced in Castile, so little was known of its practical working that its procedure was public, like that of the secular and spiritual courts. Thus, in 1483, the record of a trial in Ciudad Real speaks of the inquisitors sitting in public audience. The notaries specify as present at the hearing certain persons by name, "and many others who were there present." The inquisitors were listening to all who came before them, while the fiscal and notary were making reports. It was deemed necessary that there should be spectators to bear witness to the proceedings. Sometimes these were connected with the tribunal, sometimes they were citizens called in for the purpose, whose names were regularly entered upon the record. Even the prison, subsequently guarded so jealously, was not as yet known as the Cárceles Secretas, but as a Cárcel Pública. In 1488, the Instructions order the records to be kept "in a public place where the inquisitors customarily perform the duties of the Inquisition." The earliest indication of a change in this respect occurs in the Instructions of 1498, where the oath prescribed for inquisitors and other officials contains a pledge of secrecy. This did not, as yet, however, extend to a complete exclusion of publicity, for some Toledo trials of 1501 describe the fiscal as presenting his clamosa, or demand for prosecution, where the inquisitors were sitting, as customary, in their public audience, but during the trial itself they sat in the "audiencia de cárcel." From the expressions used we may assume that as yet the Inquisition building and the prison were separate, that public audiences were held in the former, and that the latter contained a room to which the accused could be brought from his cell when on trial. The secreto, which subsequently embraced the prison and everything beyond the antechambers, as yet only designated a chest or a room in which the records and registers were kept in safety. Yet even during this early period there had commenced, in certain portions of procedure, a practice of secrecy which markedly differentiated the Inquisition from the ecclesiastical and secular courts. The suppression of the names and identity of witnesses, and the strict seclusion of prisoners from the outside world are matters which will be more fully discussed hereafter, but already they had become distinctive features of the inquisitorial process, inflicting great hardship on the accused, which was keenly felt. The tendency of all such abuses to development, the facility with which the reasons alleged in justification could be extended over all the acts of the Inquisition, and the attraction of the arbitrary and irresponsible power thus gained, readily explain the rapid evolutionary process which enveloped, with an impenetrable veil of secrecy, everything connected with the tribunals, from the preliminary inquest and the arrest of the accused to his discharge or appearance in an auto de fe. The obligation of the oath of secrecy was rigidly construed when, in 1523, the Vicar General of Saragossa seems to have babbled about what he had heard when called in to vote at a consulta de fe, and the Suprema ordered the inquisitors to summon him and warn him not to reveal the secrets of the Holy Office. In 1544, Mari Serrana, on trial at Toledo, was charged with impeding the Inquisition, because she had endeavored to ascertain whether a certain person had testified in another case, and what he had said. The mere attempt to learn what went on within those mysterious walls was treated as a crime. In 1547, when the Tribunal of Granada was moved into new quarters, it found its secrecy imperilled by the fact that it was overlooked by some windows in the house of Francisco de Santa Cruz, and, on its complaint to Prince Philip, he ordered the corregidor to have those windows closed up, apparently without compensation to the owner. So impenetrable was the shroud enveloping all that took place within the tribunal that, when Philip II deemed it imperative to consult a distinguished surgeon who had been arrested, Inquisitor-General Quiroga left 2 applications unanswered, and to a third replied that, if the person was there, he could not be taken out, nor could it even be told whether he was or was not a prisoner, whereupon the king desisted from his request. On this, the comment of an inquisitor is that to all inquiries the answer must be that nothing is known. So when, in 1643, the Suprema argued against the claim of the Justicia of Aragon to grant his manifestacion, or habeas corpus, in secular cases, the chief reason alleged was that, if a tribunal could be required to differentiate cases of faith from others, and to admit that it had a certain person in its prison, and the cause, its secrecy would be violated. This was emphasized, in 1678, by a declaration of the Suprema that an inquisitor admitting that any individual was in the secret prison would incur excommunication, movable only by the pope. It is easy to understand why the prison was habitually designated as the Carceles Secretas, and why, when a person was arrested, he disappeared as utterly as though the earth had swallowed him. At every step in the progress of a case, minute precautions were taken to ensure absolute secrecy. It was not only all officials who were thus sworn, but accuser and accused and their witnesses were subjected to the same obligation. As early as 1531, a witness when dismissed was ordered to observe silence as to all that he had said or heard, under pain of excommunication and 1,000 ducats, and of the other penalties of those who violate the secrecy of the Holy Office. As late as 1817, in a trifling case which was suspended, the informer was fined for not having preserved secrecy. It was the same with the accused. At the very first audience, the oath administered to tell the truth contained a clause pledging him to silence, not only as to his own case, but as to all that he might see or hear. When he was dismissed, whether to punishment or to freedom, he was required to sign a pledge under oath to the same effect, to which was added a threat of punishment, occasionally taking the shape of 100 or 200 lashes. In the later years of the Inquisition, this was frequently reinforced by including in the sentence a clause prohibiting the culprit from talking in any manner about his case. The tribunal thus was relieved from responsibility and could commit injustice without fear of unpleasant revelations, and the Holy Office could boast, as it customarily did, of the exquisite equity of its judgments, without danger of contradiction. To what extent this was justified may be guessed from a remark of Peña, that no inspection was allowed of the acts of the tribunals, because they were often in conflict with the common law and the universal opinion of the doctors. End of Book 6, Chapter 2, Part 1.